level of testing weren't being given they weren't passing the information on to local people. And I understand what you're saying about smaller laboratories and the contracts, but there were people like Paul Nurse, a man of huge distinction, university laboratories, public health laboratories, all offering to do it within their remits. Do you understand, can you tell us why those were turned down and why the system between the central laboratories and the local public health teams didn't work, so that there's only a marginal benefit from all that expenditure?
Well, as I said, I think it was part of the general procurement horror in DH that people like Paul Nurse, we had companies beating our doors down in number 10 saying, we can't get people on the phone, we've got these tests, we can have them verified at Porton Down, etc., etc. That was certainly a huge problem. But also bear in mind, like another whole part of this, which I think hasn't really been appreciated so far, is that it turned out that actually there was a brilliant young woman whose name now escapes me, who basically proved in March that this technology called LAMP could work for fast tests. And there was also other work done in March showing that lateral flow tests would work. And various people put together a plan for how to scale up all of this stuff in March. Now, in retrospect, the whole of autumn could have been completely different if this had been absorbed properly by the system on testing. We could definitely, without any shadow of a doubt, we should have been able to have tests on the order of 1 million or 2 million or 5 million a day available by the first week of September. Absolutely zero doubt about it. The problem on that was, for reasons which I never really quite understood, the first I was made aware of this was just a couple of days before my operation, so it must be roughly speaking, I think July the 20th, where a special advisor inside number 10 who I brought in, who was a scientist himself called James Phillips, he came to me and said, I've been talking to a whole bunch of scientists who have been working on this testing stuff. They're basically being blocked by every part of the system on doing mass testing. They haven't been able to get the money, they haven't been able to get the manufacturing and distribution, everything set up. But this could be a huge game changer while we wait for the vaccines. Now, we in number 10 then got to grips with it. I organised a meeting with Patrick Vallance, people like John Bell at Oxford, and they both said straight away, yes, we should be doing this. Yes, it could be a game changer. Yes, we have dropped another massive ball by not working on this for the last 3 months. So essentially, in one sense, all of this should have happened from January. But then once we made the decision in kind of late March to go with Plan B and say Plan B involves testing, Plan B involves all of these different things, Plan B involves vaccine task force, Plan B involves blah. At that point, we should have been putting money into this whole lateral flow and LAMP stuff in March, April. And if we'd done that, then September would have been completely different, because we'd have been able to have literally millions of tests and fast results, immediately, like 10 minutes, 20-minute results. Because we only realised that DH and other parts of the system had completely dropped the ball again in July, late July, essentially, and I only had the first meeting on it, roughly speaking, 20th, 25th of July, all of that time again was wasted. So then we were massively playing catch-up, August, September, October, to try and build all these things that should have already been in place before September.
Thank you. If I may, one last question.
Go please, last one.
One of the reasons the English death figures were very high at the start of this epidemic was the fact that untested people were sent back into care homes and they themselves got poorly and infected other people in those care homes.
Yep.
And very large numbers of people died. Do you have any insight into how that decision was taken? And was number 10 involved in that decision, or was it entirely a health department decision?
So that was one of the other things that that we found shocking. That when we realised in April that this had happened, the Prime Minister said, a less polite version of, what on earth are you telling me? When he came back after being ill, what on earth has happened with all of these people in care homes? Hancock told us in the cabinet room that people were going to be tested before they went back to care homes. What the hell happened?
So he actually said in cabinet that...
Not in cabinet, in the cabinet room.
Oh, sorry, not in cabinet, so, but directly to the Prime Minister.
Yes. We were told categorically in March that people will be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, all the government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Thank you. That's extraordinary. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now have Anam Kaiser-Javid. She did her maiden speech last week, and it's her very first select committee. So welcome to you and your questions.
Thank you, Chair. I hope they're all as exciting and as engaging as this one. Thank you, Mr Cummings, for joining us today. So you've referred to failures and you've made apologies. Is it fair and a fair assessment, however, to say that there's been a wealth of expert knowledge, whether that's from SAGE, from the CMO, even from university papers who have researched COVID? So you've got this wealth of expert knowledge that's been available, and SAGE themselves discussed travel restrictions in early February, and they noted that direct flights from China are not the only route for infected individuals to enter the UK. And with hindsight, we've seen that to be true. We now know that most Syrian cases were in fact from Europe. So that we've got this expert advice that's telling us this. Quarantine measures for overseas travellers, however, as you'll be aware, weren't introduced till June time. And of course, there were still exempted countries, there was exempted people as well. Who was advising the Prime Minister and government to not close the borders, and on what basis?
So essentially there are two phases to this. I'd say kind of before April and then from April. Before April, the advice was completely to the... I mean, I heard this discussed several times with the Prime Minister in Number 10. He was told, we were all told repeatedly, the advice is not to close the borders, that essentially it would have no effect. At this time, I think another kind of sort of groupthink thing was, it's basically racist to call for closing the borders and blaming China and the whole China New Year thing and everything else. And that, in retrospect, I think was just obviously completely wrong. However, in some in the same way that for lots of things you can't blame the Prime Minister directly, that was the official advice. The official advice was categorically closing the borders will have no effect. I inquired into it. I said explicitly, if we're not going to do it like Singapore and Taiwan and whatnot, we're going to have a bloody good explanation to the public, because they're going to be asking, why on earth are we under these restrictions, but the borders are open? After April, though, it's a completely different story. Once we switch to Plan B, and we're going to build, we're going to do test and trace, we're going to do vaccines, we're going to try and stop the second wave, etc., etc. Fundamentally, there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy. Repeatedly, in meeting after meeting, I and others said, all we have to do is download the Singapore or Taiwan documents in English and impose them here. We're imposing all of these restrictions on people domestically, but people can see that everyone's just coming in from infected areas. It's madness. It's undermining the whole message that we should take it seriously. And his basic argument at that point, he was back to lockdown was all a terrible mistake. I should have been the mayor of Jaws. We should never have done lockdown 1. The travel industry will all be destroyed if we bring in a serious border policy. To which, of course, some of us said, there's not going to be a tourism industry in the autumn if we have a second wave. Like, the whole logic is completely wrong. If we don't bring in a proper border policy now, and a bunch of other things. We're going to have a second wave in the autumn, and everything is going to be shut. Forget just tourism. But he was, he had the Daily Telegraph with their stupid campaign on the whole subject. He had Tory MPs going crackers about it at the same time. And essentially at that point, he was in, we should never have done lockdown, I should have been the mayor of Jaws, now I'm going to be, open everything up, get on with it. And me and others just could not win that argument. We never won the argument. As of today, look at the whole thing about variants. We still don't have a proper border policy, in my opinion.
Sorry. Is it a fair assessment to say that the economy and finance was prioritised over people's lives when you think about a border policy to encourage people to travel into this country, to spend money, to rejuvenate the economy? Was that prioritised over people's
Again,
lives?
I would say you have to distinguish. It would not be fair to blame the Prime Minister for what happened before March, because all the scientific advice from SAGE and the DH was to do that. So I think you can't. He definitely was not prioritising tourism over the economy in January and February. I heard him say explicitly myself to the science advisors and to the Department of Health, hang on, aren't a lot of people going to think we're mad not closing the borders? So the Prime Minister did push on that in January and February, and it would be wrong and unfair to say that he prioritised the economy at that point. However, after April, it's a different story, and at that point, yes, he was prioritising the economy.
Okay. So I just find this really interesting. So prior to my election, I was a secondary school teacher. I taught modern studies and politics, and I specifically remember a lesson in early January 2020 when the first outbreak happened, or when we were discussing it in class. And I was explaining to my pupils that there's an area called Wuhan in China, this is happening here, and then linking it to what I teach. We spoke about if you were the Prime Minister or if you were a government advisor, what steps would you be doing to develop those critical thinking skills?
Yeah.
My 13-year-old brains understood the concept of closing the borders or stopping people from entering or leaving the country.
Yeah.
If 13-year-old kids from Edinburgh could understand that, why is it a fair assessment then to say that the government, well, 13-year-old kids were thinking more than the government? Is that a fair assessment?
I think there's no... My perspective on it is that huge parts of the public health, if you just look at, this is sort of part of a general issue, huge parts of the public health administrations in Britain and America were captured by memes which were obviously ludicrous. They said, don't wear masks, masks could be dangerous. Turned out to be complete nonsense. They said, don't close the borders. It's, as you say, common sense, obvious nonsense. It's just, in my opinion, it's unarguable that obviously we should have shut the borders in January. We should have done exactly what Taiwan did on whatever it was, New Year's Eve or whatever. We should have said, right, dunk, that's it. Yes, that has some disruption, but the kind of cost-benefit ratio is just massively out of whack. And at least it's worth a try. Like lots of things, at least you try it. If it doesn't, like, what's the worst that's going to happen? If it doesn't work, okay, well, you've still got the whole nightmare to deal with anyway. But as it was, we were dealing with the whole nightmare. So there was just no fundamentally good logic to not shutting the borders in January, in my opinion. And there was never any logic to it after April. To begin with, the Prime Minister was confused, everyone was, everything was, as I described, was a nightmare. But from the summer, fundamentally, the view was, well, we're past it now, COVID's in history, etc., which was obviously just a terrible mistake.
So leading on from that, leading on from that, during this point, the devolved nations were calling for tighter restrictions. The devolved nations were calling for tighter restrictions in terms of border control.
Yeah.
Who in the government had that responsibility of achieving a four nations agreement on this?
I mean, essentially, the Prime Minister had responsibility for it, and there were numerous meetings in the cabinet room where we kind of, percolated up through the system. Department for Transport was not keen on doing it either because they were all worried about the effects of tourism.
Okay.
But fundamentally, that decision was made repeatedly in the Cabinet Room in Number 10.
And would you, or are you of the opinion that the views of the leaders of the devolved nations were listened to during this, specifically thinking about the border policy?
I can't really say if they were well listened to or not, to be honest. I mean, I can't really remember what they were saying, and I can't really remember much of the discussion around that question.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Okay, one last question, if that's okay. So as I said, I'm a teacher, and you obviously have school inspections that happen. In England, it's Ofsted that run it. You've got 4 grades. So you've got grade 1 is outstanding, grade 2 is good, grade 3 is required improvement, and grade 4 is inadequate. How would you rate the government response on those 4 grades?
I would say some individual brilliant performances, overall system total failure.
Okay, so you give it a grade 4, inadequate. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you. Mr Cummings, I think what you've told us so far about social care is astonishing, but I'd like to ask some more questions about it, because clearly what we're talking about is hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people in care homes, 1.5 million care staff who, we're talking at the February-March time into April, were without PPE and testing. Now, you've said on social media that one of the worst failings was the almost total absence of a serious plan for shielding or social care last March. And there was a widespread delusion we had a great plan, it turned out barely to exist. Why didn't Number 10 move quickly to protect care homes, which everyone knew would be vulnerable in an infectious outbreak?
So it was discussed, and we were told that people would be sent back to care homes after they'd been tested for COVID, and we were told that there was a plan for shielding. It turned out that neither of those things were correct. We didn't really understand the catastrophe around people being sent back to care homes who were already COVID infected until April. We realised the lack of a shielding plan in, roughly speaking, the week of the 9th. I organised a meeting on it in Downing Street on Thursday the 19th. And we looked at it then, and essentially we realised that yet again, as soon as you poked holes in things, there was nothing there. And essentially what happened then was that some officials said, there's basically nothing we can do. We haven't built the tools in advance. We can't get all these databases to communicate and whatnot. And this is where we're in this ludicrous situation of we're going to send out these shielding letters without putting in the helpline number, because the helpline number was basically not set up and they hadn't got a call centre to answer and everything else. And I said, and others said, well, what the hell are all these people going to do? I mean, we're telling them they've got to stay at home and that someone's going to help them, and they've got to stay at home, otherwise they're going to die. But we're not giving them even a number to call to say that we need food, we need medicines, we need other help. Like, what's going to happen to all these people? And essentially there was a lot of shrugging. And thank goodness, a group of officials led by this great woman called Jen Allen, who worked in the government digital service. She worked with a guy called Oliver Lewis, and they basically got a team together between the Cabinet Office and the digital service and CLG. And there was a brilliant SPAD in CLG called Olivia. She kind of got some people from CLG together and said, and they kind of jiggled together a team and said, right. And then they got a company involved and said, can you basically make all these databases talk to each other so that we can put the helpline out, and then people call up, we can take the details, and then we can get food delivered to them. And it was a bit of a similar kind of thing to the data between faculty and the NHS. Similarly, a company called, I think, Newton, but I might have got that wrong, worked with this team with Jen Allen, and they figured out a way to kind of bodge together these databases so you could start to do it. But it was all done essentially in literal all-nighters over the night of Thursday the 19th, over the next few days, to try and get this ready.
Okay, well, that's shielding, but I think the comment I read out to you that you've made was about social care as well. It doesn't appear there was any plan for social care. There might have been no plan for shielding. There was no plan for social care.
Fundamentally, yes.
In fact, it was reported in the media in March that you outlined the government's strategy in February, and it was said to be herd immunity, protect the economy, and if that means some pensioners die, too bad. That's in February. Was that the view held in government about the deaths of older people from COVID?
No, and also I never said that. It's that story in the Sunday Times had invented meetings on the 12th of an invented meeting on the 12th of March, which never actually occurred, as you can see from the SAGE documents. It had an invented story about me in general and why I changed my mind and when I changed my mind and everything else. And I had this fake quote in. It actually caused huge trouble. I had people at my house threatening to kill me as a consequence of it. The journalist involved said afterwards it was the worst professional mistake of his career, but the damage was done, and it created this terrible impression that essentially we didn't care about people. Yeah, but it was not. It wasn't true.
We didn't care enough to have a plan for all those people needing care. We didn't care enough to have a plan for people in care homes or for people receiving care at home who necessarily had to have people coming into their homes or necessarily had to live in homes which are not generally suited for infection control. This is an infectious outbreak, and care homes, people come in and out, they're working there. And there are visitors. It's
not just the view of me. I literally spoke to people who work in the Cabinet Office today who said, when I look back, one of the biggest things that it was just terrible is the lack of a plan for that. And
Well, let's just examine what happened then, because you talked about what happened on discharge. On March the 17th last year, NHS England wrote to hospital trusts telling them they could maximise bed capacity by discharging every patient they could safely discharge. Now, at that point, there was hardly any testing of those people. You've said that, I think you said that there was an intention to test, or it was said there was an intention to test, but it wasn't possible to test. On that major policy change of discharge, was that change discussed at meetings between NHS England and ministers and advisors? What were the views around at the time of the risks? Because surely somebody weighed the risks.
Yes, it was discussed. It was discussed in the Cabinet room in front of me and the Prime Minister and Secretary of State Matt Hancock and other senior officials.
And what were the views of the risks that were being taken by doing that?
As I said before, we were told that the people were going to be tested.
Right.
And we obviously discussed the risks. We were thinking, hang on, this sounds really dangerous. Are we sure? But it was a kind of, there's no alternative because the whole original plan had gone so badly wrong. The view was, we've got to try and free up beds in the NHS to deal with the wave that was coming. So the view was, there's no alternative, but secondly, we were assured that the people who were being sent out would be tested. And as I said, it was only in April, after the Prime Minister and I had both ourselves been ill, that we realised that what we were told would happen never did happen, or only happened very partially and sporadically. At least, I'm sure some people were tested, right? But obviously, many people who should have been tested were not tested, and then went back to care homes and then infected people, and then it spread like wildfire inside the care homes. And also, the care homes didn't have the PPE that they needed to deal with it, and they didn't have the testing for the staff. So you had this kind of cascading series of crises, like domino effect, rippling out through the system.
I think that probably wasn't seen until September, was it, that it would be staffed too. So in those discussions between the NHS England and ministers or advisors, you said it was discussed in the Cabinet room. What estimates were made of the impact of discharging positive cases? There must have been some estimates given, because clearly in a hospital setting, I think it's understood that NHS staff were infecting each other in hospitals, so there's going to be a level of infection. What estimates were given as to the risks? of that discharge?
I never saw any estimates about it. I think that in the conversations I saw, essentially the issue was just never properly it was never properly analysed or discussed in front of the Prime Minister, me, the Cabinet Secretary.
So that major change on discharge from hospital was made without evidence of the potential risks and of the potential numbers that may already be infected?
Well, it was made without a serious plan or capability to cope with the consequences, for sure.
Yeah. Why do you think nobody commissioned evidence on that topic? I mean, you've said various things about the Secretary of State and about the state of the department. Is that the cause?
That's my assumption.
Would you have expected them to have commissioned evidence on that before they took that decision, before they put that decision out there?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes, everything's connected. It goes back to the whole disaster over testing. We didn't have enough testing, we didn't have enough PPE. Because we didn't have enough testing, enough PPE, then it wasn't provided to care homes. My impression looking back was that in the same way no one thought about how to produce the details of what to do on shielding, and therefore I had this terrible meeting on the 19th on shielding. I just think that the whole thing around care homes was the same, that just fundamentally it had never been properly dug into. And what happened was, in the crisis environment of complete chaos in that week of around the 16th, as we were heading towards lockdown, people just said, well, we've got no alternative than do this. And why on earth Hancock told us that everyone was going to be tested, I've absolutely no idea. But we all now know that it definitely didn't happen.
Who was there when he told you that?
I can't remember everyone, but it was a formal, like all of those meetings. We stopped doing the meetings in Cobra, and from kind of the week of the 9th, the daily COVID meetings were all in the Cabinet room. So often, don't get confused. Cabinet was essentially not really relevant to any of these things in the March period. When I say the Cabinet room, I'm not referring to Cabinet meetings at all. Often the only people there were the Prime Minister, Hancock, and then occasional other ministers that were relevant to that specific thing. So this meeting was PM, Hancock, Cabinet Secretary, me, bunch of number 10 staff, some DH staff, other people on Zoom, possibly Simon Stevens there, possibly not, I don't remember now.
Okay. Looking back at the whole thing then, after COVID was seeded into care homes, do you think... Looking back now at what we're just discussing, after COVID was seeded into care homes, do you think the government, including SAGE, was taking that risk of transmission into care home settings as seriously as they should? And I want to look at this in the context of what you've said since. Was it the start of the thinking by the Prime Minister that has been reported as COVID is only killing 80-year-olds? Was there a sense that it kind of didn't matter because it's people at the end of their lives and it just didn't matter?
So it's two different questions there. Your first question, I think, was essentially, was this taken seriously, properly, and everything else by number 10, etc., etc. The answer is obviously no. It was not thought through properly. There wasn't any kind of proper plan. It's clear in retrospect that it was just completely catastrophic situation happened with these people being sent back untested and then seeding it in care homes. I think there's no other way to describe it than that. Like all of these things, it wasn't deliberate. It was just it was a function of the overall fact that the system was just completely overwhelmed. The Prime Minister's views on COVID and who it had killed was relevant, but that was relevant in September, October. It wasn't relevant to this point now.
Okay, thank you.
Dean Russell.
Oh, I'm happy to go.
I do apologise. It's Luke Evans next. Apologies, Luke.
Thank you, Chair. One thing we do have control over in an emergency is the way in which we communicate. Arguably, that's your strongest suit, given your track record with Brexit. What would you score the government out of 10 on its communication, both to the NHS and to the public, 10 being this is gold standard, or 0 being the lesson learned, we should never do this again? I
think that So some of the people working on the communications were some of the best people in the world. And one of the great myths about the whole thing is that, the reason for all of these problems was bad communications. Fundamentally, the reason for all these problems was bad policy, bad decisions, bad planning, bad operational capability. It doesn't matter if you've got great people doing communications if the Prime Minister changes his mind 10 times a day and then calls up the media and contradicts his own policy day after day after day. You're going to have a communications disaster zone. A few things are discussed more inaccurately than communications. So inevitably, there were certainly mistakes made on communications for sure, but all the big things that people think, why did that go wrong? Why did that go wrong? Like for example, the whole thing with Rashford. The Director of Communications said to the Prime Minister twice, do not pick a fight with Rashford. Obviously, we should do this instead. The Prime Minister decided to pick a fight and then surrendered twice. After that, everyone says, oh, well, your communications are stupid. No. What's stupid is picking a fight with Rashford over school meals, and what should have happened is just getting the school meals policy right. So it's easy to blame communications for bad policy and bad decision-making.
Let me pick you up on that, because no plan, stands the test of time when it hits the enemy. This was a novel virus. But the benefit you have in communications is we went into a second lockdown. So what were the lessons learned from communicating in the first lockdown that came out to play in the second lockdown? And looking at that, there was a third one which you weren't involved in, but I'd be interested in your lessons learned, because that's what the essence of this inquiry is about.
I think the same thing happened in the autumn as happened in January. It was bad policy and bad decisions. The problems in the autumn were not fundamentally communications problems. They were that the Prime Minister made some terrible decisions and got things wrong and then constantly U-turned on everything. That's not a communications failure. You see it, everyone in the outside world sees it as a communications failure, but the reality is it's much more fundamental than that. The autumn disasters were fundamentally not communications problems. The communications problems were a consequence of bad decisions and bad management.
So were you in charge of the communications at this point? Are you saying this isn't my problem, Gov, it's what I was given?
No, I mean, as I said earlier on, I had the only time between the election and leaving Number 10 that I was really engaged with communications at all was the period kind of late February until me and the Prime Minister becoming ill being tested positive on the Friday. That kind of 3 to 4 week period. Both before that and after that, I was very little involved with communications, because I fundamentally disagreed with the Prime Minister on what is good communications, how to do communications, how it should be structured, how we should approach the media. On pretty much every single major thing, he and I completely disagreed. So I tried to use my time where I thought it could be better spent. For example, in the autumn, I spent, literally near zero time on communications and huge amounts of time on mass testing and on the defence review and on the economy and other things like that, procurement reform, etc., etc.
How well were you involved in the lockdown measures draw up, and what was your understanding of the lockdown measures?
Which one are you talking about? In March or?
First one.
I was heavily involved in the period between. If you're talking about the communication of the lockdown measures, kind of between trying to formulate Plan B on the 13th and then actually doing lockdown 10 days later. Do you mean then?
Well, the understanding for the public when the measures came out over what's involved in what you can do, why we keep 2 meters apart, who can go to what, when we can go to school. What understanding did you have that of where we can travel?
Yeah, I was heavily involved with that, but again, the problem there was not. I had all the communications people were screaming. We haven't got anything to explain to the public properly, or what we have got is all contradictory because we haven't got an actual plan. That was the problem. The problem wasn't in the communications team. The problem was what they were being given.
Okay. Moving on to a second point, and it's to pick you up on all your evidence you gave at the start. At 11:09, you said to the member for Salford and Eccles, "It's completely crazy that I should be in such a senior position." You also then said you realised this was a massive problem, and yet you didn't take action. Why didn't you resign straight away? Or why you had the power to hire? Why didn't you hire your replacement? And did you say to the PM that you didn't feel you were competent?
So I did hire various people into Number 10 to try and raise the quality of the team there, including myself. For example, bringing in people like Tom Shinner. We built the analytical private office in there. There were lots of different people I brought in to try and provide expertise and skills that I didn't have and which also didn't exist in Number 10. And that did actually help. So in January, when I did that blog saying, Number 10 doesn't have these skills, we need to hire people, by September, we had built that team, and it did make a huge difference. And I think we'll come on to in terms of the September decisions. Terrible decisions were made, but they were made for completely different reasons than they were made in March. By then, there was a different set of skills and a different set of people. In terms of why should I have resigned, as I said, arguably I should have resigned in March. Arguably I should have resigned in May. And I should definitely have resigned in September.
So in answer to that question, I'm just wondering where you draw the line on your personal responsibility in the decisions that are made. You said you didn't speak up because you were worried about the fact that you might be getting it wrong and people may die. There was a certain infamous trip, and that had huge influence on how people perceived the lockdown. Again, you said it was the problem of the policy, not in the way in which it was messaged across. Where do you draw the line for you having personal responsibility for the decisions both in government and about the way you conduct yourself?
So I think I should probably explain some things about this that were not put into the public domain at the time in the Rose Garden, because that whole episode was definitely a major disaster for the government and for the COVID policy. So I'll explain something about it and then and why we got things so wrong. In the autumn 2019, I had to move out of my house because of security threats for about 6 weeks. On the 28th of February, when I was dealing with the COVID problem, on the Friday night, I was down in Westminster, and my wife called saying there's a gang of people outside saying they're going to break into the house and kill everybody inside. She was alone at the house at the time with our then 3-year-old. After that, I spoke to the PM and the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara, about the situation, and it was suggested that possibly I either move my family into a government accommodation or move them off to family. On the 22nd of March, the story happened, which the lady mentioned earlier, about that fake quote from me, basically implying that I was happy for everyone to die, which led to further problems. After that weekend, I then said to my wife, right, we've been discussing it for a month. We've got to get out of here on Friday. So before the whole thing happened, with the Prime Minister being sick, my wife calling up on the Friday and everything else, it had already been decided that I was going to move my family out of London, regardless of the COVID rules. That was discussed with people in the Cabinet Office and with the private office. Now, what happened is, because of this, we kept the whole thing very quiet. Almost nobody in Number 10 knew about it for obvious reasons, because I didn't want the same problems to pop up at my parents' house up in Durham. When the story then came out, the Prime Minister and I agreed. When the first story came out about me, much of the story was completely wrong. It suggested that the police had spoken to me about my behaviour because of the lockdown rules and whatnot, which was completely false. The police had only spoken to me about security issues, but the media presented it as if I'd been talked to by the police for breaking lockdown rules. The whole story was crazy. the Prime Minister and I agreed that because of the security things, we would basically just stonewall the story and not say anything about it. And I was extremely mindful of the problem that when you talk about these things, you cause more trouble for yourself. And I'd already put my wife and child in the firing line on it. So I said, I'm not talking about this, we should shut our mouths about it, and the media stories are all basically, loads of it is wrong, and ignore it. Prime Minister agreed. Then on the Monday, he was under so much political pressure and media pressure that he said, this line won't hold, we're going to have to do something about it. Now, at this point, I made just a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake, which I'm extremely sorry about. What I should have done, in retrospect, is I should have called my wife and said, listen, you and our boy are going to have to get out of London again. I'm going to have to just explain the truth about this whole thing. Get out of London, we'll hold a press conference. Instead of that, we had a kind of chaotic situation in Number 10 where the Prime Minister said, we're going to have to do something, you're going to have to explain something. And I said, I'm not explaining these security things, otherwise I'm going to have everyone mobs back outside my house. So I ended up giving the whole Rose Garden thing, where what I said was true, but we left out a kind of crucial part of it all. And the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and then it undermined public confidence in the whole thing. The truth is, when the Prime Minister said on the Monday, we can't hold this line, we're going to have to explain things, if I just basically sent my family back out of London and said, here's the truth to the public, I think people would have understood the situation, and it was a terrible misjudgment not to do that. So I take, the Prime Minister got that wrong, I got that wrong. We both made a terrible horlicks of it in a very odd circumstance on the Monday. So that hopefully explains that situation and makes clear that I know that my misjudgment on it caused huge trouble. And I deeply apologise for it.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings, and I'm sorry that you felt threats to your family and indeed to yourself and your safety. No one should feel that. However, this is about lessons learned. One is they're talking about coming forward and giving the truth. The second is, with regards to that, where do you see your personal responsibility on this, the media's responsibility on it, and government's responsibility to looking after the people who are being representative and making these tough decisions in a world emergency?
Do you mean specifically on this particular episode, or do you mean in general?
Yeah, this particular episode, because what we don't want to happen is something like this happen again that undermines public confidence. If there's ever to be another pandemic, we need to learn the lessons so that these situations are avoided.
I think a fundamental lesson of it is the same as the fundamental lesson on Sage and so many things, that openness is better. Like, essentially, we took the decision because of the security problem, and I didn't want to go through the whole thing of moving my family again and everything else. And I felt guilty about the whole thing as well with my wife. Fundamentally, that was a terrible, terrible mistake, though. It would have been much better just to come clean on the whole thing, tell the truth about it at the time, and then I think it wouldn't have been the fiasco that it became. So I guess the fundamental lesson is the default on everything should be openness. If we defaulted to that on this, it would have been harder for me in some ways, but it would have been better for the country, and that's what we should have done.
Thank you. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much, sir.
Obviously, it is totally and utterly unacceptable that you or your family should face threats, but there's just one thing I didn't quite understand in your narrative. If you were moving your family out of London for security reasons, why did you move them back?
Because essentially, I've been on, during that time in that next 2 weeks, I've been lying there thinking that I might die. I was extremely ill. On the 12th, the day before we came back to London, I could still, I could really still hardly walk 50 metres. And if it had been up to me, I would have left my wife and child behind. But she was extremely worried about me. She was worried that, what happens if I just collapse at home? I'm by myself. who knows what state you're in. The medical advice was that I shouldn't be basically rushing back to work. I should stay and rest. But the Prime Minister had literally nearly just died. I was getting all these messages from everybody saying that the government's in free fall. If you can get back, you should go back. So I went back. She was worried about me, and therefore she made the decision, I'm going to come back with you. We all had to make very difficult decisions at this time. If I could have done, I would have left them in. I would have left them in Durham, frankly.
Thank you. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. If you don't mind, I'd like to explore this a little bit more, but with the Durham trip. And I also echo the comments about the awfulness of having security risks to your family. That's just never acceptable. But a lot of the issues around messaging, was about trust in the messaging from government, the trust in you and in officials, and in particular around behaviour change. And most of the messaging during that time were 3-word statements. There was stay at home, there was protect the NHS, more recently hands, face, space. And I think the nation just wanted to hear one statement from you, which was a 3-word statement, which was I am sorry. And I just want to understand, Mr Cummings, why you just didn't apologise when you were in that rose garden.
Because, as I think I've tried to explain, there were sort of multiple things going on in my head about it all. I couldn't really tell the whole story about it. Or I felt I couldn't. I should have done it at the time, but felt like I just didn't. For the reasons I've described, I think that my behaviour in leaving London at the time was perfectly reasonable. And other people in the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister and everyone agreed with me that it was reasonable for me to move my family out of Durham. So I was caught in this thing of, well, are you going to apologise and say it was a terrible mistake? The truth at the time was, no, I wasn't sorry about moving them out of London. And I didn't think it was a terrible mistake. I thought it was completely the right thing to do. But the problem was we were trapped in a situation where I was only telling part of the story. So the whole thing was just a complete disaster.
And with regards to that, though, what was
Obviously, I am extremely sorry about the whole thing, the way that the whole thing worked out, because the reality is I had all the security problems again afterwards. Twice further, I had to move my family out of the house again because of problems at the house, despite the COVID rules. I stress, for all the journalists watching, the further stories about me going back are false. It is true that I moved my wife and child back out of London, despite the COVID rules, but that was in discussion with the police. I did not leave London. And all of these stories about me being elsewhere and me going off whatever, those stories are all categorically false. But it is true that I've moved my family out again. So the truth is I had all these problems again anyway. I didn't dodge them, and that's why it would have been better just to explain it all at the time, and I'm extremely sorry that I didn't.
Why is it taken till today, though, to make that? And I can really sympathise with the issues for your family and so on, and appreciate that. But why is it taken to this committee to hear you actually apologise in hindsight, given the fact that I think an apology at that time would have lifted a lot of the pressure? Because I think the nation's back was up over it because they felt that, rightly or wrongly, that you'd sort of done it and you sort of said, look, that was the right thing to do, move on, whilst everyone else in the country was following the guidance and not getting to go to funerals, not going to see their families, not hugging their family and friends, and worried about their lives. And the presumption, especially in the press, was that you'd sort of done it and didn't really have an apology to give.
Well, I mean, I did understand at the time, and I do understand at the time, people talking about, people being very upset and their relatives. My own uncle died, while I was in bed with COVID, my own uncle died in hospital of COVID because of this whole problem about hospitals and infection in hospitals and whatnot. So I very much did understand people's anger about it. All I can say is, after the complete debacle around the whole thing, it just didn't seem like coming out and then trying to explain it all while I was still in government was a sensible thing to do. And then after I'd left, it's kind of the last thing I wanted to do was draw attention to the whole thing, and to my house and everything else again. As it is, again, I've had to move, I've moved my family out of our house now for this whole public thing. I've got the whole street has got cameras and everything else around it. But I figured that today is today's the day for just getting the whole terrible story on everything out so everyone knows the reality. And hopefully this is a case study of how not to handle something like this. As I said, it's clear in retrospect that once it was clear that the Prime Minister wasn't prepared to hold the line, I should just have said, right, family out, I'll explain the whole facts, and that's it. And I think most of the country would have understood it. But we kind of just did the worst of all possible worlds.
And with regards to that, did everyone in government and Number 10 appreciate the real sheer emotion of the country at the time? I mean, in my constituency email box, we had 1,000 emails from people really angry about this. Was a realisation of that disconnect?
Yes, we knew as soon as the whole thing had happened, we knew that I knew that the whole thing was a complete disaster.
And do you feel that you were unfairly targeted by the media? It felt to me that during that time there were quite a few cases of high-profile individuals breaking the rules in various forms, whether it be the blurry edge of it or completely. Why do you think you were targeted so much by the media over a very sustained period of time?
I mean, I've never complained about the media. I've never threatened to sue the media. I think if you're someone like me who's in the public eye, and you say, as often as I have over the last 20 years, that as many critical things as I have about the media and how they cover important stories, then they're going to throw things back at you when they've got a chance to. Also, fundamentally, a lot of the media realised that there was a kind of tension in Number 10 between me and some of my team that wanted to try and change the culture of Number 10 away from what it's been for 30 years, which is essentially a press answering service where everything is dedicated to the media day in, day out. I regarded this as a disaster, and I wanted to try and move the whole culture of governing away from that. And there was huge tension because the Prime Minister's view is literally, you couldn't get a more diametrically opposed perspective on it. For him, he just gets up, reads the papers, says, right, what are they doing today? And then cannons around. And the media realised that there was this tension going on and that I was essentially trying to massively diminish their influence, and therefore they wanted rid of me. And so from their point of view, rationally.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Just in relation to the Rose Garden Downing Street, the press conference there, you've made some very, very big allegations today, and we're yet to see the evidence in the emails and so on. And you've raised on several occasions that around that time, prior to that time, actually, March, February, you had very serious concerns. You had the UK's media in front of you, in fact, some of the world's media. Why didn't you raise some of those concerns then, given the fact that you knew in your mind, from what you've said today, that many lives were at risk?
Do you mean, why didn't I speak to the media and say, I think the government's plan might be disastrous?
Yes, or variations of that. Because you're making those suggestions now, a year later, again, after the horse has bolted, if that's the case. Why didn't you use that platform at that time to say, look, I've got grave concerns, we need to change direction?
Because I thought the right thing to do was to try and make the arguments internally and change the Prime Minister's mind and change the official plan and kind of shift it from plan A to plan B. I think if I'd suddenly started calling the media in the week of the 9th, so as I started having meetings with people in the 9th on plan A is a disaster, we've got to shift plan B, if I'd then started calling everyone in the media and saying...
Sorry, not calling, but you were in the Downing Street garden, you had what I felt was a bit of a witch hunt approach of one journalist after the other asking you a question after a question, but there was a platform there for you to say, I'm really concerned that lives are at risk, that we should be changing things. What was your decision to not raise that in public at that time, given you're now saying that you had major concerns?
Well, it's a kind of constant problem that people like me have to wrestle with all the time. That other people in this room will have wrestled with. It's the tension between, if you threaten to resign, you've got to be serious about it. Otherwise, your bluff is called. If you leave, then you lose basically all control, unless you're going to put a gun to someone's head publicly. If you stay, then you've got a chance to try and influence things. I thought at the time, as I said, I thought very, very seriously about resigning in the summer. I was dissuaded from doing so by the Cabinet Secretary and by other senior people who said, please stay, don't do it. You know, you have that tension, and I don't know quite what. So I think in retrospect, I was probably right not to resign in March. I think in retrospect, I was definitely wrong not to resign in September. Whether or not I should have gone in the summer or not is, I don't know.
But you mentioned there about tensions between decisions, and what we've heard this morning is that you've said that you had no real power, yet you took the test and vaccination programme off the Secretary of State. You had major concerns a year ago but didn't raise them in front of the media when you had an opportunity. You were concerned about making decisions that would put people's lives at risk, yet you took a trip to Durham, which I appreciate you've explained in more detail now. Do you get that there's a, listening to this for the past 3-4 hours, that there's sort of you didn't have any power, you didn't have any control, you had the ear of the Prime Minister but didn't really use it, and yet on the flip side you were able to make things change. I just think from a perspective of decision making, it just something doesn't connect there for me.
Well, I think all people all over Westminster exaggerated. I think arguably they underestimated the influence that I had between July and December 2019. Arguably, they massively exaggerated the influence that I had after the election. The whole idea that I was the second most powerful person in the country and all of that, and I could just click my fingers and do this and do that and do the other, was just completely wrong. If I could have clicked my fingers and done things, there would have been a serious border policy. Masks would have been compulsory. Hancock would have been fired. We'd have done, dozens and dozens and dozens of things. What happened is, fundamentally, the Prime Minister and I did not agree about COVID. We did not agree about COVID after March. After March, he thought the lesson to be learned is we shouldn't have done the lockdown. We should have focused on the economy. It was all a disaster. I should have been the Mayor of Jaws. I thought that perspective was completely mad. I had very little influence on COVID stuff. I mean, I tried, I made arguments, but as you can see, on pretty much all the major arguments, I basically lost, did not win. What I therefore did in the summer was I brought in Simon Case to be the Permanent Secretary at Number 10 because I thought the Prime Minister's not listening to me on this whole subject. Our relations are getting worse and worse. His girlfriend is desperate to get rid of me and all my team. If I bring in someone official to try to take over on COVID, that will A, make things better, and B, maybe he'll listen better to Simon Case than he will to me, which to some extent did happen. And then I spent a lot of my time in kind of May, June, July, not on COVID, but on defence, science and technology, procurement reform, planning regulations, the economy, productivity, innovation, data, all of the civil service, all of these sorts of things. And I tried to use what influence I had on those things where either the Prime Minister agreed with me or he didn't really care, in which case I could push things on. But it wasn't really useful, me just sitting in meeting after meeting on things like quarantine, where he just didn't agree.
So just for my final question, sorry for the time taken, Chair. For lessons learnt moving forward, it sounds like you were perceived to be, the chief advisor, whatever the title may be, to the Prime Minister, but your advice was not being taken. And was that because of the fact that you didn't bring people along with you to agree with your advice to then have that to get the Prime Minister to listen? What was the reason for that? Because the bit that comes to my mind is that if we go into another pandemic in a few years' time, how do we set up the structures according to what you're saying today to make sure that advice is listened to? Because ultimately, shouldn't you be effectively the canary in the mine to be able to say, actually, there's stuff coming down the line that we need to do something on? And it sounds like your advice, from what you're saying, was not taken on board, rightly or wrongly.
So I think it's hard to sort of generalise about some of these things. I think on lots of stuff on COVID, actually there was a centre of gravity in Number 10 for the same view around that agreed with me, but the Prime Minister just wouldn't do it. On many issues, Me, the Cabinet Secretary, the Chancellor, other senior people agreed. But the PM just wouldn't do what we advised. So I think the problem wasn't necessarily I couldn't persuade other people on lots of things. I mean, everybody was screaming on quarantine, have a policy and set it out clearly and stick to it. We cannot keep changing your mind every time the Telegraph writes an editorial on the subject. Everybody agreed with me about that, regardless almost of what they thought the real policy should be. But nobody could find a way around the problem of the Prime Minister just like a shopping trolley smashing from one side of the aisle into the other.
Well, interested to see the evidence. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just before we move on from this, with respect to Barnard Castle, one of the things that really upset people wasn't taking your family out of London. It was that trip when you were up there that you said was to test your eyes, but others said was actually a birthday trip for your wife. Do you stand by that account?
I think if I was going to make up a story, I'd have come up with a hell of a lot better story than that one, right? I mean, it's such a weird story that... Like the truth is, like only a few days before then, I'd been sitting in bed writing like a will, like what to do if I die. I then was thinking about coming down on the 12th, the Sunday, but I was basically too ill to do that. And my wife said, "Look, you're in a state. You can barely walk. Like, are you sure you're okay to go back to work? Are you sure you're okay to this whole thing?" And I don't know, I mean, I try to explain this all the time. It seemed to me like, okay, if you're going to drive 300 miles to go back to work the next day, then pottering down the road for 30 miles and back to see how you feel after you've just come off what you thought might be your deathbed didn't seem crazy to me at the time.
Did it not seem crazy to do that test with your wife and child in the car with you?
No, it didn't. Didn't seem crazy.
Does
it's
it not seem a bit crazy now?
Let's get in the...
That you are testing your eyesight with your wife and child in the car with you?
It didn't seem crazy at the time. It seemed just like, okay, let's get in the car, drive up and down the road. If I feel bad, come home, see how I feel as I get going.
Okay.
But I can completely understand that. I can completely understand why people think the whole thing was weird. And obviously, I wish I'd never heard of Barnard Castle, and I wish I'd never gone, and I wish the whole nightmare had never happened. But hopefully, people can even if they don't agree, hopefully they can understand. As I say, I can only apologise for the whole debacle.
Okay, we have talked a lot so far about things that went wrong, but I think we should spend some time on the big thing that went right, which was the vaccine programme. And I've got three colleagues who want to ask you about that. But just let me open by saying, what is it that you think we got right on the vaccine that was so different to some of the other things that we've been talking about today?
I think fundamentally on vaccines there was clear responsibility. There was someone who was actually in charge of it, Kate Bingham, and she was working with Patrick Vallance. She built a team of people that actually understood what they were doing, and she had the kind of strength of character not to be pushed around by... So we had a kind of formal thing which was, you're in charge of it, you report basically directly to the PM. You don't report to the Department of Health. So she knew kind of who her boss was on it. Built a great team, and we also said to her, treat this like a wartime thing, ignore rules. If lawyers get in your way, come to us. We'll find ways of bulldozing them out of your way. And it just... Clear accountability, people that really understood what they were doing, relative to almost everything else in Whitehall, extremely low friction, and some great kind of technical help. I think those things, when you put them together, meant that it worked better than pretty much anything else. I think this is not in any sense a comment on Kate. I think the fact that it worked out relatively well to the rest of the world, though, shouldn't blind us to the fact that we only really got that going. So I think my first conversations about the idea of it with anybody were in March. Patrick Vallance texted me on roughly the 24th, I think it was, of March. Something like that. I've got the exact date. Like lots of other things, though, there's no doubt that we could actually have done this faster than we did. The conventional wisdom was we're not going to be able to have any vaccines by in 2020. Now, in March, I started getting calls from various people saying these new mRNA vaccines could well smash the conventional wisdom, don't necessarily stick to it. People like Bill Gates and that kind of network were saying. So essentially what happened is there's a network of people, Bill Gates type people, who are saying completely rethink the whole paradigm of how you do this. Build in parallel. Here is the science thing, here is the manufacturing thing, here's the distribution, here's the supply, here's logistics, here's the data. The normal thing is you kind of do those sequentially. What Bill Gates and people like that were saying to me and to others in number 10 was, you need to think of this much more like some of the classic programs of the past, the Manhattan Project in World War II, the Apollo program. Build it all in parallel. Now, in normal government accounting terms, this is completely crazy, because if nothing works out, you've spent literally billions building all of these things up, and then the end result is nothing, you get zero for it, it's all waste. But what Bill Gates and people were saying, and what Patrick Vallance and Patrick's team was saying was, the actual expected return on this is so high that even if it does turn out to be all wasted billions, it's still a good gamble in the end. And all the conventional Whitehall accountancy systems for this can't basically cope with it, and you've just got to throw them all down the toilet. And that is essentially what we did. Patrick came to me and said, I want to do this. I think we must take it out of Department of Health. Bear in mind, this was at the time we were having all these conversations about PPE, about testing, about shielding, about all the things we've gone through today already, with all of these different things being wrong. Patrick said, take it out of the Department of Health. Will you support me on that with the PM? I said, absolutely damn sure I will. I spoke to the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary completely agreed, because also he was watching all of these meetings in April about all the problems that DH had. So weirdly, this was one of the things that actually had almost no real formal meetings and actually very little discussion. Patrick, me, and Cabinet Secretary all basically went to the Prime Minister when he came back from being ill and said, there's just no alternative. We've got to do it like this. It's inconceivable we can leave it in DH. Here's the structure. And the Prime Minister just decided in 90 seconds, fine, do it. And that was it. And there was basically not really any formal structure. There was a little bit of whinging here and there there's a little bit of pushback in some quarters saying, this is extremely risky. If you don't go down the EU approach and that works and we do it ourselves and it doesn't work, you guys are all going to be in a huge political hole.
But you have to take risks.
But you have to take risks. And when we looked at the EU plan, not just me, but all the people that really understood vaccines and some procurement experts that we asked to look at it all said, well, the EU plan just looks like the classic EU Brussels thing. It's going to be completely bogged down in bureaucracy. They're not going to be able to take the right financing decisions. They're not going to do this parallelism approach of building everything and subsidising everything as you go along. So it seemed at the time like that was just clearly the right thing to do. And thank goodness that was one of the few things I think that we got right.
Thank you. Let me bring in my colleague Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Chair. I was meant to come in earlier, but I had a PMQ, so I'm not going to go entirely on vaccines at the beginning. I just want to pick up on some points, Mr. Cummings, that you made earlier regarding herd immunity. You said that it was an unavoidable fact and it was the official plan of the government. Did the Prime Minister specifically acknowledge that pursuing this would result in an excess of 500,000 deaths? And was he okay with that death toll or death toll of that margin?
So the Prime Minister was definitely aware that as I said earlier on, that herd immunity by September in a single wave was the official plan A. That's on the COBRA document that I shared with you as it's described, the optimal single peak strategy. On the 12th, the Prime Minister, like me, heard in the conversation about chickenpox parties and the interviews that a few people gave about herd immunity, and the Prime Minister, like me, started to think, hang on a second, this sounds at best extremely frightening. Is this really what we're going to do? But as I said, up until when we had the meeting on the 14th, the whole point of that meeting was, here is the real numbers on what the herd immunity by September strategy really means. It's on the best case 260,000 people dead. On the DH's own thing, we can't do that. We just can't do it. We've got to gamble on an alternative plan. But at that point, remember, the conventional wisdom was, if you do gamble on an alternative plan, it's not going to be 260,000 people dead. It might be 2 or 3 or 4 times worse than that in the autumn. And that was the whole argument that kind of played out between the night of the 13th and when we decided to lock down by, kind of the weekend of the, 18th, 19th, 20th, the back end of the following week. But it's completely bizarre. Everybody knows that the Secretary of State for Health, the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer were all briefing Laura Kuenssberg, Robert Pester, and all the key media people in the week of the 9th on single peak herd immunity by September plan. It's totally bizarre and incomprehensible to me that the government that Number 10 would now be trying to deny that when it was officially described. It's on all the official documents, the CSA, etc., and people from SAGE all said it on TV. And the Cabinet Secretary described it as the chickenpox parties thing on the 12th. That was the whole... So I'm completely baffled as to why Number 10 is now trying to deny that was the plan. The whole point is that was the original plan, but we realised what the consequences of it were going to be, and we decided that it was intolerable and we had to try something else.
This issue and the issue of whether the Prime Minister's inactions have led to deaths was asked at PMQs, and the Prime Minister said that all of these matters will be reviewed in the course of a public inquiry, which will start next spring. You've already said that that would be too narrow in scope. Do you support the calls of bereaved families for a statutory public inquiry that's independent and led by a judge?
I don't know about being led by a judge, because often these judge-led things actually don't, the history is they often don't really get to the bottom of it. But the principle of it, yes. I think the idea that any kind of serious inquiry and lessons learned doesn't start till next year is completely terrible. The families of all, tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. There's absolutely no excuse for delaying that, because a lot of the reasons for why that happened are still in place now. Look at the whole debate about variants and whatnot. This has to be honestly explained. If Number 10 today won't tell the truth about the official plan, which they briefed the media about and described on TV a year ago, what on earth else is going on in there now? So yes, I do. And I also think, if you go back, and this is not about dragging Brexit into anything, but if you go back 2 years, if MPs could seize control of the legislative programme and say, we are in charge, not Number 10, when it came to Brexit and the second referendum, why on earth can MPs now not take control and say, it's intolerable that this can be delayed? The elected representatives of the families of people who died who didn't need to die must get to grips with this now. There is absolutely no excuse for delaying it. And the longer it's delayed, the more people will rewrite memories, the more documents will go astray, the more the whole thing will just become cancerous.
One of the issues has been the Prime Minister's reluctance to actually meet the COVID family group, the bereaved families. Why is the Prime Minister running away from meeting with them, do you think?
I can't imagine why.
Okay, I'll move on to my question about contracts. So Byline Times and the Citizens Overview of Contract Awards reveals that a year after the first COVID lockdown, almost £1 billion in government contracts has been awarded to 15 firms that are linked to Conservative donors, and they've had more research that continues showing this trend. During your time at Downing Street, was there concern about the contracts process, that it wasn't fair or transparent, and was anything really done to address this?
Initially, there wasn't initially in kind of February, March, no. Like, all of our concern was just this disaster coming at us, and my concern was all the kind of blocks in the procurement system and us not being able to do things like sign fast contracts with testing companies to get testing ramped up when PHE didn't have the capability and stuff like that, and PPE. So I would say January, February, March, my concerns and most of the concerns in number 10 were really about capability and speed and buying what we needed and getting PPE to the front line and things like that. Later on, there were concerns, yes, because various stories started to come out into the media about what was happening, and then we suddenly started reading things about VIP channels and whatnot, and what were these VIP channels and who was in charge of them and how had that all been done. But that didn't really cross my radar until, I can't really remember, but I would guess probably something like May or something. Not in the first phase for sure.
In terms of some of the contracts, a contract with a jeweller worth £70 million for sterile gowns, almost all of them couldn't be used because the contract didn't request double packaging. Another contract for face masks, completely unusable because they had the wrong type of fitting. In terms of some of these mistakes, the government have said, we were in a panic situation, we just had to order things. In hindsight and going forward, what kind of processes do we need to make sure that we're not throwing millions, if not billions of pounds, essentially down the toilet for wrong items?
So I think I won't bore everybody with going back through the history of this, but I said many times before, including actually, well, I won't go into that. Many times before, that the procurement system is completely unfit for its purposes in Whitehall. Ironically, in January and February, when I should have been paying far more attention to COVID, one of the big issues, all this media stuff about culture wars and whatnot, I had literally zero to do with any of that nonsense. One of the big issues I was dealing with in January and February was this procurement thing, and I was bringing in outside experts. There's a guy at Oxford called, he's got a very, very hard to pronounce name, Ben Fidgeberg, I think you say, to try and address this problem of how do you get a serious procurement system. The problem is that we just didn't have time to sort this out before the crisis hit. The fundamental thing is that there needs to be a legal, proper, emergency, fast-track process. And there needs to have people with the skills to execute that at speed and at scale. And a fundamental problem that you had in February, March, April was you had a legal structure with a whole bunch of horrific EU laws, and then you had a whole bunch of horrific Whitehall gold plating on top of that. And then you had a set of officials who'd only ever worked inside this system. And then you had this completely unprecedented crisis. And then you had people like me shouting, call the airlines, tell them we're taking their planes, we're flying them to China, find the nearest airfield, throw the PPE in the back, fly it back now. There was no system for doing anything like that at all. So everyone was just kind of like, can we do that? Is it legal? What happens if we do it and then everyone starts suing us, etc., etc.? So the obvious lesson, and one of the things that I spent my time on in the summer and autumn, was changing the legal combination of changing the legal framework and changing the kind of recruitment and the skills and the training and everything, so that you've got a set of people in place that can just do that. You know, there should be a kind of trigger point, right, where either Parliament votes on something or the Prime Minister presses a kind of button mark panic. And when that is done, you kind of move to, here's the normal process where it's fine to take 12 months over something, or it's fine to take 6 months over something, or whatever it might be. But here's the emergency system where people are authorised to just go, right, we've got to smash this, we've got to execute at scale, we've got to do it all fast. If that means just calling people up and doing handshakes over the phone and we'll get the money to you, take off now, then that's what's got to happen. But we didn't have, that just did not exist, that approach.
The last question.
Yes, my final question is actually about vaccines, just bringing it back to the top. You've mentioned Bill Gates, Mr. Cummings, who has vocally opposed IP waivers. And we know that vaccine production globally is throttled for many reasons, whether it's the control of vaccine supplies by wealthier countries and the hoarding of vaccines. If you were advising the Prime Minister, would you also be supporting President Biden's move to support lifting patent protection? And what is your opinion on vaccine IP?
I don't really have an opinion on it. I strongly suspect that Bill Gates knows far more about this than President Biden does. If Bill Gates is saying that this is a big mistake on vaccine production, then my kind of prior view would be he's almost definitely right, and we should, at the very least, take his opinion extremely seriously.
Thank you very much indeed. Greg Clark.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. On vaccines, you said that it was Sir Patrick Vallance's idea to set up the vaccine task force. Is that right?
Certainly Patrick Vallance had the idea. I think, like lots of good ideas, there are a few different people thinking about similar kinds of things at the same time. Certainly Patrick, I've got a text from Patrick Vallance where he texted me directly on, I think, the 24th of March. I could confirm that if anyone thinks it's relevant, where he says explicitly to me, I want to set up a vaccine task force and do it outside Department of Health, correct? I and some other people were having kind of parallel conversations with others round about the same time. And then essentially Patrick and I both spoke to the Cabinet Secretary about it.
The deal with AstraZeneca, between Oxford AstraZeneca and the government, that was done before the vaccine task force was set up. Do you recall who was instrumental in bringing that to bear?
My memory of it is that Patrick Vallance was instrumental in it.
Right. So it was. So he was involved in both of those initiatives.
Well, Patrick, before he came into government, had worked in the private sector, working literally on vaccines. So he understood and actually knew a lot of the key players involved. Certainly, my conversations on the AZ vaccine were with Patrick, and there was at one point a terrible fright that Department for Health was about to sign a contract, basically a duff contract on AZ, which would not have given us the rights to the vaccine, or would have left them questionable. And Patrick kind of intervened and sorted it out and made sure that the contract worked out properly, thank goodness. So I think Patrick deserves absolutely massive, enormous credit for his role in the vaccine task force. There's no doubt about it. I think, as far as I'm aware, he's the first senior official who came up with the idea. The other people who I know were talking about it were kind of people outside of government. He was the first official to come up with the idea. He pushed it. He came to me. He came to the Cabinet Secretary. He made the case to the PM. And I think he deserves enormous credit from the country for his role in it.
Absolutely. So in terms of lessons learned, that's clearly a very strong positive. I think you referred earlier to the idea that actually things may have been done perhaps even quicker, triumph though it was. And I think you were referring to starting human challenge trials earlier. Was that something that was contemplated? And tell us about the history of that suggestion.
So I think, to stress, this is not my idea. So this is not like some idea that I think that I've come up with, which is a good idea. It's not. It's essentially the idea is that normally, obviously, for any kind of vaccine thing, you have a whole testing process, and you've got to take quite a lot of time to go through it all, because you've got to make sure, if you've got a disease that's killing, say, 1 or 2% of the population, then you've got to make sure you don't have a vaccine which kills more than that. However, for something like this, I think from the point of view of like overall human civilization, how could we have done better? I think it's unarguable of what should have happened. The companies doing mRNA vaccines basically created the vaccine itself in literally hours in January. Hours. What should have happened is that governments like America and us should have gone to those companies and said, right, we're going to take your idea, we're now going to have what's called human challenge trials. We will pay 5,000, 10,000 people, and we'll pay you to be injected with COVID. And then you have some kind of control system where you're injected with COVID, some of you get this vaccine, some of you don't get this vaccine, and then everyone takes their chances. And then, if you die, your family will get £1 million or whatever, something like that. That would have obviously been the best thing to do. And if we'd done that then, we could have hugely cut the time, I think, for doing this. We could definitely have got vaccines in people's arms by September. And the reason why I think this is an important thing is, imagine if we suddenly have another thing like this, but it's not like COVID, it's something like smallpox or Ebola, which kills 1 in 3 people, right? We have to be able to have a system that doesn't just go, oh, well, tens of millions of people are going to die, nothing we can really do, we've got to go through this safety challenge process. We've got to think now, and this is why I'm so aggressive, I suppose is the word, about having this lessons learned thing now. We've got to have a system in place where we go, holy Lord, new Ebola thing, right, mRNA companies, Pfizer, where's the vaccine? Right, 10,000 people, what's the price that it pays?
So this is one of the reasons we're conducting this inquiry, so we can get on with lessons that can be learnt. But just to understand it, was the fact that we didn't do that, and as I say, there's no criticism of the fact that this was done at remarkable pace, were we constrained by regulation or by a kind of distaste for the risk involved in injecting healthy people with COVID?
I think there's definitely regulatory issues that need to be sorted out, but I think, fundamentally, like lots of things, a kind of groupthink mentality meant that just in general it was never properly explored. I mean, a few people did suggest it, and it was talked about.
Who suggested it?
But I actually can't remember now who suggested it. I know that there were conversations around about it. I got emails from some people saying you should be doing this. It was one of the many things that I should have pushed harder and tried to force a conversation about and didn't do enough on. But it was just as far as I'm aware, it was just never really properly discussed. But obviously should have been.
Just a couple more areas. You've raised concerns that the plan for vaccination or the adjustment of vaccines to new variants. I think I sensed from some of your recent tweets that you think that's not as sound as you think it should be. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not in government anymore, but I talk to people who are involved with it, and people have just expressed concern to me that since Kate Bingham left, that the kind of normal entropy process of Whitehall has got its fingers on the thinking and the operations around this, and there hasn't been the kind of very aggressive approach that some inside government want about thinking through the danger of variants and how to make sure that the vaccine task force is ahead of the game on the whole thing. I mean, I can't go into any details because I'm not aware of them, but I've had senior people express this concern to me. Yes.
Is that a personnel or an organisational concern? So what's happening? Is the kind of the forest sort of creeping back into the clearing?
I think it's a combination of both, yes. I think there's been a shift in personnel as far as I understand it, and concerns about the organisational setup.
Right. You've spoken very positively about Kate Bingham's role in this, as well as Sir Patrick and others. She went through a difficult time in the autumn, in which she was being criticised roundly from a lot of quarters, and some of that briefing was alleged to come from Number 10. Were you aware of that at the time? Did you pick up that this was a problem?
I was aware that there was briefing against her. I was told at the time by officials that they thought that most of this had come from DH, but like most of these things, one never really got to the bottom of it. Certainly nobody who you could describe as being part of my core team obviously was involved with that. And nobody, I asked all of them, do you know where this is coming from and what's going on? And the closest we got to is essentially people in the system kind of feeling either their noses put out of joint or jealous about her profile or whatnot. Lots of outside. One of the bad things that happened was lots of outsiders who came in to volunteer to help. The same thing happened in terms of test and trace. People who dropped massively lucrative careers to come and help test and trace also got trashed in the press by parts of Whitehall, which I thought was terrible. And Kate, I think, got caught in that sort of crossfire.
So you're not aware of any particular briefing against her from Number 10, but conversely, there was radio silence from Number 10 in terms of defending her. And my understanding is that she had to threaten to go on a broadcast round personally before there was a response from Number 10. Again, were you aware of that?
So, as I said earlier on, I tried to stay very far away from kind of day-to-day media things. I've got a vague recollection of a time when there was some kind of problem and her call. I think she might have called the PM directly or something, and said essentially that I'm very unhappy about what's going on, and I want some support from Number 10. But I wasn't part of that conversation, and I don't really know what happened, I'm afraid.
But given the significance of her role and the praise that you've quite rightly lavished on her, did you not feel, observing even as a reader of the newspapers and the blogs, that hold on, we should be backing the work that she's doing?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I was concerned, we were. I mean, we obviously supported the work of the Vaccine Task Force.
But in terms of Kate Bingham's role in that?
I mean, Number 10, as far as I was concerned and as far as I was aware, Number 10 was always supportive of the Vaccine Task Force and supportive of Kate Bingham. As I said, I tried to escape, I tried to keep out the way of lots of conversations with the Prime Minister about briefing and leaks and all that sort of thing. So I'm not the person to speak to about it. All I basically remember is there was some briefing against her. I asked at a couple of meetings, where do we think this is coming from? The best guess of people in Number 10 was parts of Whitehall have had their noses put out of joint. I also vaguely remember some Sunday Times story about her, but I can't remember what that was. But I don't think I can add anything very useful to the discussion.
Finally, just looking back and thinking of the system, when you appeared before the Science and Technology Committee, you talked about the deal that you did with the Prime Minister when you came in to be his advisor in Downing Street. And you said that there were 4 components of it. One was to get Brexit done, the second was to double the science budget, the third was to create a new research agency modelled on DARPA or ARPA, and the fourth was to change the way that Whitehall works. Now, again, you've talked about this a lot in your blog in 2019. You talked about turning government institutions responsible for decisions about billions of lives and trillions of dollars from hopeless to high performance. So this was one of the things you thought about and you brought into Whitehall. Looking back, as we are and as you can now, some of the failures have been organisational and operational. The fact that we had to stop testing in the community because we didn't have enough tests. The fact that we ran out of tests in September. Why did something that was such a priority, in which was part of the deal for you being in Downing Street, why was it not possible to have made good progress on that during the 9 months that you were there, say from July to the spring of 2020?
Well, I mean, July 2019 to the election was essentially just completely dominated by the constitutional crisis over Brexit. and we did not really we didn't have the bandwidth or the real authority to start trying to change all sorts of things in terms of Whitehall. We had to be very focused on what it was that we tried to change. So, for example, we did change the whole decision-making structure around the negotiations and around Brexit. We did change radically and effectively. I started work on things like the procurement reform, but it's also the case that the situation was so overwhelming, particularly after the kind of prorogation and the Supreme Court judgment, that in September 2019, I had senior officials come to me and say, the system's creaking and very shortly senior people are just going to stop obeying orders from this Prime Minister and are going to regard it as not a legitimate government. So it was a really, really weird time. That wasn't an environment in which you could suddenly start saying, right, we're going to have all of these huge shifts to the basic wiring of Downing Street. And Whitehall, once we came back in January, I did begin a lot of this process. I talked to the Cabinet Secretary about making various changes with the civil service HR system. As I've said, I started a whole process from the beginning of January in terms of trying to change the procurement system and other parts of it, and the data side. The problem was that we basically only had a kind of 6 weeks for going back the first week of Jan to COVID sort of completely overtaking everything from kind of mid-February to change things. Now, one of the things that did happen, which was relevant to the September decision, was building the what's known as the Analytical Private Office in Number 10, which I think will be a permanent institution and will become a permanent part of how every subsequent Prime Minister works. I think no one in their right mind would possibly get rid of it, and everybody involved with it knows it's been a great success. So I think that is that shows, if you read the media, you'd think that this was all some huge row between me and all the officials and everyone hating it and everyone screaming at each other. But the truth is, pretty much all the good senior officials completely supported me on that and helped to help me do it. And it was a joint enterprise. It wasn't Cummings against the system. It was all sensible people realised that this was a huge gap in Whitehall capabilities, and we had to try and change it, both structurally and in terms of the specific skills.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. James Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Cummings, and I think your 6th hour in front of the committee.
Feels like 1 minutes.
You've talked about the success of the vaccine task force. Are there lessons to be learned from that can be applied across government?
Certainly, I think, as I said, some of the core principles of who is actually responsible for the team. Jeremy knows, Greg knows. Like, the British state is set up almost by design to create a dysfunctional system, because you have to go out and potentially resign over things that are being done, and you cannot fire a single person apart from your spads in the department. Like, nothing that works well literally nothing that works well in the real world ever works like that. It's a completely crazy system. So you have a system in which responsibility is by design diffused and no one knows who's really in charge. One of the key things in the vaccine task force was we tried to just keep things very simple and to have it. How do really good things work? You know who the boss is. It's her team. Kate is going to pick the people. Patrick's going to give scientific advice. And if it turns out that Kate Bingham is no good, we'll get rid of her like that and we'll put someone else in who is responsible, etc., etc. That was the whole reason for the approach. She picked the team. She did a good job in picking the team, and everyone knew that they were working for her. They weren't working for Hancock. They weren't working for the Permanent Secretary in DH. They weren't working for the Cabinet Secretary. And that very, very simple principles are the core of the difference between well-run organisations and badly run organisations. Mm-hmm. So I think there's obvious lessons to learn. The problem is that in much of Whitehall, it kind of suits everybody to be in the Spider-Man meme of everyone pointing at each other and saying, well, it's him, no, it's him, no, it's him, no, it's him. And changing that is, even after a disaster on the scale that we've seen, it's going to be a really big job to have those conversations like, well, is the Secretary of State actually in charge of this? Can they really do that? Because the Cabinet Secretary, a lot of people are going to have criticised Mark Sedwell, but Mark Sedwell was perfectly within his rights to say to the Prime Minister, Matt Hancock is the Minister responsible, and he was correct. But we were also correct to say, but so-and-so is in charge of this and so-and-so is in charge of that, and I can't fire them. Like, fundamentally, the only person who could fire them is the Cabinet Secretary, and the only way that happens is if the Prime Minister tells the Cabinet Secretary to fire them. You know, the whole thing doesn't work if it's like that.
Okay, so moving on to COVID therapeutics, obviously success in that field, but you have said previously that funding bureaucracy held back progress.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that and how those issues were overcome?
In February, March, various scientists and entities came to Patrick Vallance and me and basically just said, you know, that there's a standard kind of scientific funding process. It takes a long time to get through, but we're in this wartime situation. Can you basically bulldoze some of the rules out the way? Can you speak to UKRI, etc., etc.? We did do, both Patrick and I talked to UKRI and other parts of the system and said, here's what the blocks are, A, B, C, D, can you try and scupper these and basically create like a fast track process. So if people like Paul Nurse call up and say, we can do blah, you can just go, right, how much 10 million done, how much 20 million done, etc., etc. And I think that was, it certainly wasn't perfect, but it did change quite dramatically, kind of February to April.
Okay. And the recovery trial has been respected around the world in its success. What do you put their success down to?
I think it's similar sorts of principles, clear responsibility, some great people in charge. There's a guy called Jeremy Farrar, I think, who played a critical role in it. I mean, part of my job is I know far more about the things that went wrong, if you know what I mean, the things that went right. Like, if things seemed to be going right and people were saying that's okay, I had so many other things to deal with that I kind of didn't really go into it. So the recovery trials I don't really know very much about because people just said it seems to be going well. I only got involved with Jeremy Farrar if he called me up and said I've hit the following problem. Otherwise, I just kind of let people get on with it.
Okay. Now, these are UK-wide endeavours. One of the criticisms has been the disjointed approach across the UK with devolved administrations in particular. What do you recall of discussions over using public health legislation with respect to, or in comparison to, civil contingencies legislation?
Again, my memory's pretty hazy, but fundamentally, the Cabinet Secretary said the Civil Contingencies Act is essentially useless. It was drafted back in the 70s. It's had a few tweaks, but it's completely fit for its job. If we try and rely on lots of its powers, we face a problem that various people who don't like it will go to the courts and will suddenly be bogged down in judicial reviews at a time when, you know, we haven't got 3 weeks to go to a court, even on a fast-track process. So that was a big problem, and that's basically why we introduced the kind of emergency coronavirus bill. Again, one of the reasons I think now for why you guys are right to be having this inquiry is that upgrading the whole Civil Contingencies Act is a critical thing. One very simple example of that is the whole question around enforcement. One constant problem that we had all the way through the spring and summer and into the winter was, well, the police say that their powers are unclear, we can't do this, the courts won't uphold that, blah, 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 and the emergency powers are unclear in various ways. And so we were kind of found ourselves in this situation of people arguing for greater and greater restrictions on certain law-abiding people because they felt that we couldn't actually enforce certain rules against non-law-abiding people, which was a kind of terrible ratchet to get into. So I think that's another thing. I'm afraid I'm not at all kind of knowledgeable about that side of it, but I do think that's an important question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to adjourn now. That concludes the section on the vaccines. We've got one more section to do, which is on the run-up to the November lockdown. And we'll reconvene at 3:05 for that, just to give people a slightly longer break. So, session adjourned, order.